Are indie game companies today charging too little? Or maybe too much, as some might have you believe? Is $15 for something like Braid too much to expect for an indie title, even one as well received and innovative as that? Jeff Vogel from Spiderweb Software couldn't disagree more, and luckily for you, we'll be diving in head first to explore the reasons why. My name is Ryan Wienko, and you're listening to Industry Broadcast. But before we start today's article, I just want to thank Mr. Jeff Vogel for taking the time and energy to write it, reminding everybody that his website, showcasing all of his produced titles to date, can be found at spiderwebsoftware.com. Indie games should cost more. I have a friendly message for my fellow indie game designers. You really need to start charging more for your games. Every year, life is getting more and more expensive. Insurance, rent, food, and at the same time, your games are getting cheaper and cheaper. Sometimes as cheap as $1 as you engage in a full-speed race to the bottom. Now don't get me wrong. Some games, casual quickies, simple puzzle games, should be inexpensive. But everybody, retailers, reviewers, customers, is enabling a mindset where all games, even the niche products and larger, deeper, less casual titles, are expected to be desperately cheap. This is not going to help developers stay in business. This is not how a healthy industry is maintained. Creating the expectation of insulting cheapness. There is an increasing attitude that indie games should be cheap, super cheap, like pennies on the dollar. How can a developer make a living that way? Cheap. Xbox Live gave the trend a big push by charging $5 or $10 for most titles. That was still enough to get rich on when the gold rush was going. It isn't going anymore. I was genuinely surprised when people seriously complained that Braid, one of the coolest, most innovative titles of last year, was an entirely reasonable $15. Then Microsoft created XNA, a set of tools anyone can use to write and sell games on the Xbox. Sounds cool so far, but the maximum anyone can sell their games for is $10. Not good. Think that some games should actually sell more than that? You are apparently crazy. Then Amazon opened their game download store, selling old titles for $10 or less. Not good. Now the iPhone has boldly lowered the bar, with $4.99 being the highest price point for most of its titles, and the user reviews on most of these $4.99 titles are about how excessively expensive they are, as if. And many of the games are going for 99 cents. Once the gold rush is over, only the lowest budget, most casual titles are going to be able to make any money at that price. Bargain basement prices are becoming the expectation. But it hasn't always been that way. A bit of history. When I first founded Spiderweb Software in 1994, I spent a lot of time thinking about pricing my first game, Exile. Back then, there was a good rule of thumb for pricing your shareware product. Charge half as much as comparable products being sold in boxes on store shelves. Back then, new games sold for $50, so Exile was $25, which was a very common price for shareware games back then. A few years later, I started sending the registered version on a CD instead of emailing a registration code. I charged $30 for the CD. Sales changed very little. 2 years later, I went back to an email code system and lowered the price back down to $5. Sales changed very little. 3 years ago, I looked at all of our expenses, credit card fees, postage, insurance, etc., and went, holy crap, I'm going to need to raise the prices to account for this. So we raised our prices to $28, still about half of the price of comparable products on store shelves, and since then our money intake has actually increased. We're doing quite well now. And yet, in the last few years, indie game prices have been falling through the floor. They get more and more expensive to write, but are approaching unheard-of levels of cheapness. So, what's the problem, loudmouth? Some games are being sold cheap, and that doesn't bother me. Some games should be sold cheap. Braid and World of Goo, both fantastic games, are perfectly priced at $15 for 6 to 7 hours of rich, no-filler play. $28 would be too much for them. What bothers me is the increasing number of outlets where low prices, no matter what quality or depth or size of the game, are the expectation. Hi to you, Amazon and iTunes. This squeezes out the niche products. Niche products like single-player RPGs, adventure games, and war games are going to have small, intense audiences. They need to charge a fair price to survive, and that means taking all factors into account. How should you price an indie game? The difference between an amateur and a professional is that the professional knows how much to charge for his or her work. When people argue about how much an indie game should sell for, they tend to ignore several important factors that should go into the decision. How big is the game? Braid lasts for 6 hours. That's about $2.50 an hour. A little on pricey side, but the game gets away with it by being so much fun. Our newest game, GeneForge 5 Overthrow, lasts about 30 hours, or less than about $1 an hour, not counting considerable replay value. $28 seems very fair. How niche is the game? Economics says that scarcer things should sell for more. A Bejeweled clone is common and thus should be cheap. Good single-player RPGs are scarce. They should sell for more. How much do I need to earn to live? Suppose your game takes a year to write, and thus counting salaries needs to earn about $100,000 to break even. If you sell it on iTunes for 99 cents, after Apple's cut, you need to sell about 130,000 copies to break even. That's a lot of copies. A spiffy and addictive puzzle game, which is harder to write than you think, might sell that many. A plot-heavy niche RPG, no. When you price your game, you take the factors into account and you come up with a number. Then you try to sell the game. And if the number you need to charge is too high for what the portals will let you charge, you have a real problem. And when good games get squeezed out of the market because of penny pinching, we all have a problem. Indie developers are harmed by a blanket idea of what their games should cost. Everybody who allows this bargain basement attitude is part of the problem. Why do you charge so much? In the last 15 years, I have heard just about every reason why my games should be cheaper. These arguments refute infallibility, the known maxim that the customer is always right. Or much more accurate, you can't win an argument with a customer. If you charged less, you would sell more copies. This is true. The problem is that I won't sell enough to justify the lower prices. Microeconomics tells us that as we charge less, we sell more, but we make less per sale. At some point, there is a best price, a point where the number of sales times the profit per sale is at its maximum. The question is, where is it? Based on my experience shifting prices up and down, I think that I'm actually at the sweet spot. But suppose I charged a World of Goo price, like $15. This would roughly half my profit per sale. Because of the way credit card fees work, the less I charge per sale, the smaller percentage of profits I make. To make up this cut, I would have to say double my sales. Double. That's a huge increase. Doubling would be big. Based on the data that I've received from distributors, I believe that about 3% of my downloads turn into sales. This is called a conversion rate. To make up for the price point, I would have to increase my conversion rate to 6%. This is a huge rate, pretty much impossible to get for a niche product like mine. If I had a more casual-friendly product, I might manage it, but that's not my niche. I have to set a price to reflect the nature of my niche. So what should be done? After all of this griping and ranting, I should offer some actual suggestions for what should happen in the future. If all of us, developers, customers, distributors, want a healthy indie scene in which we can all make money, we should all want the people who make the content to be able to make a living. Developers, figure out the right price for your game and stick with it. Don't let anybody shame you into going lower. Sure, it stings to pass on distribution on Amazon, but if you can't get the price you need to charge, swallow hard and move on. Maybe if they aren't able to sell more of the titles they want to sell, they will change to a wiser path. Distributors, don't set arbitrary price ceilings, like at Amazon or Xbox Live Community Games. If you are setting the price yourself, use the developer's price as a guide. Then let the magic of the marketplace do its work. punishing the foolish and rewarding the smart. If a game is too expensive, the prices can be lowered later. But if you overly lower your prices and don't support the people who make the products that make you money, well, that's not in your simple dollars and cents best interest. Don't cut the developers off at the knees before his or her product even reaches the market. None of this is unreasonable. I'm not being all idealistic and hippy-dippy. I'm just using hard, simple business sense. This accelerating rush to give our products away is simple craziness. So go ahead, try it. Charge what you're worth and see what happens. You might as well, because we'll all have to do it sooner or later, and you might as well do it while you're still in business. And that's a wrap on another great article from Mr. Jeff Vogel, whose company's website can be found at spiderwebsoftware.com. I'm Ryan Wienko from IndustryBroadcast.com, where our single goal in life is to bring the collective insight of the gaming industry to your ears.